It was a crisp morning in early spring when Mark Adams first noticed something was off. The soft chirping of birds was interrupted by the unmistakable sound of a car door slamming. He glanced out of his kitchen window where the sun was just beginning to rise, casting a golden glow on the quiet suburban street. Mark had always enjoyed the serenity of his home, a small, modest house nestled at the edge of a cul-de-sac. His life, though unremarkable to most, was peaceful. He spent his days working from home as a graphic designer, often retreating to his backyard for lunch, surrounded by the comforting silence of his neighbors' well-maintained lawns and white picket fences. But that morning, something felt different. A shiny black SUV was parked by the curb, its windows tinted dark enough to obscure the passengers inside. Mark squinted, recognizing the vehicle as belonging to Karen Thompson, the self-appointed leader of the neighborhood HOA. Karen had long been the bane of the community, always ready to issue fines for even the smallest of infractions, whether it was a stray leaf on someone's driveway or a mailbox that wasn't up to her exacting standards. But lately, she had become particularly fixated on Mark's property. The reasons were vague, but the effect was clear. Karen had taken it upon herself to scrutinize every corner of Mark's life. As Mark stood at the window, he saw her step out of the car. She was wearing her usual outfit, a stiff, pressed blouse and tailored pants, her expression one of someone who believed she was on a mission. Behind her, two other figures emerged. Both were middle-aged men dressed in nondescript clothing, carrying clipboards. Mark didn't recognize them, but the way they followed Karen with military precision made it clear they were more than just her hired hands. These were her goons, as Mark had come to call them. They were the ones Karen brought in when she needed to intimidate or inspect someone's property, especially when she had no legal right to do so. Mark's suspicion grew as Karen and her goons made their way toward his yard. The way they moved, quick but deliberate, suggested they had been given orders. But what was the target this time? He hadn't received any official notice from the HOA. No letter, no warning. Just Karen and her entourage, seemingly determined to poke around his property again. He'd been through this before. Last month, she'd tried to fine him for a small fence he'd put up in the backyard without permission, claiming it wasn't the right shade of white. He'd argued it was a privacy fence not visible from the street, but Karen had none of it. Now it seemed she was back with a vengeance. Mark's stomach tightened as he watched them approach the back gate. The gate led to his shed, a structure he'd built years ago. From the outside, it seemed like nothing more than a simple storage shed, but in reality, it served a much more important purpose, one that Karen and her goons had no business snooping around. He had always kept it locked, but he hadn't expected anyone to try to break in. Not like this. He couldn't help but feel a knot of anxiety settle in his chest. He'd learned the hard way that dealing with Karen never went as planned. This time, he had no idea how far she was willing to go, but it felt like the calm before a storm. From his vantage point, Mark could see Karen's sharp eyes scanning the yard. She was walking toward the shed now, her goons trailing behind her. As they approached the shed, Mark could feel his pulse quicken. Was she really going to push things this far? The shed was off limits, a private space, not just for storage, but for something far more sensitive. Mark took a deep breath, silently cursing Karen under his breath. He had hoped for peace, but it seemed that wasn't on the agenda today. The sound of Karen's voice broke through the silence. She was ordering her goons to inspect the shed. He could hear her tone, authoritative, demanding. The two men moved toward the door, fumbling for a set of tools. Mark's heart raced. This wasn't just about a fence or a small infraction anymore. They were about to cross a line they didn't understand, and it was up to him to stop them. But how? How could he possibly explain to these people what was in that shed without it escalating into something even worse? The tension in the air was thick, and Mark could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. As the goons worked at the lock, Completely unaware of the danger they were inching toward, Mark knew that things were about to change. The stakes had never been higher. What would happen when they opened that door? What would they find inside? More importantly, what would Karen do when she realized she had no idea what she was truly messing with? Mark didn't know yet, but one thing was certain: this wasn't going to end quietly. Hey, real quick, if you're enjoying the video so far, make sure to hit that like button, share it with friends, and subscribe for more awesome content. And while you're at it, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. All right, let's keep going. Mark had always been careful about what he kept in the shed. To the casual observer, it looked like any other storage space. Nothing more than a few gardening tools, old lawn furniture, and some boxes collecting dust. But for Mark, it was far from ordinary. The shed was his personal sanctuary, a place where things, important things, were kept hidden from the outside world. He'd built it himself, just a few years after moving into the house, and it had always been a source of pride. The wood was weathered now, the paint chipped from years of sun and rain, but it still stood sturdy against the elements. It was small, inconspicuous, tucked away at the edge of the yard, hidden from the prying eyes of neighbors, which was exactly how Mark wanted it. There was a certain comfort in its quiet, solitary existence, and over time the shed had become a repository for more than just tools and lawn equipment. Mark didn't talk about it, not to anyone, not even to his closest friends, but the truth was, the shed had been converted into a storage space for something far more significant, something dangerous. Inside, hidden beneath old tarps and stacked crates, were weapons. A lot of them. Firearms, explosives, even tactical, gear, all carefully organized, all stored under the watchful eye of the ATF. It had started years ago when Mark's old college buddy, Paul, had reached out. Paul had become an agent with the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, and he had a problem, one that involved more than just criminal activity. The government needed a secure, quiet place to store sensitive materials, and after some conversation and assurances of discretion, Mark had agreed to help. He wasn't a criminal, but he had always been a bit of a patriot, and the offer had seemed harmless enough at the time. He had no idea how big things would get, how much trust the ATF would eventually place in him. But what was stored in that shed now wasn't just a few weapons. It was an entire cache of classified, high-grade materials, some of which could bring down entire criminal organizations if the right people got their hands on them. The weight of that responsibility wasn't lost on Mark, but it had become a part of his life, something he had learned to manage carefully, ensuring no one else would ever stumble upon it. Not even Karen Thompson and her HOA Goons, who had no business being anywhere near it. For the past few weeks, Mark had noticed strange things happening around the neighborhood. A car would slow down in front of his house, but then quickly drive off. A couple of times he'd spotted unfamiliar faces walking near his fence line, their eyes darting as if they were casing the property. He'd chalked it up to coincidence. After all, he wasn't the only one Karen had been targeting. But as the days went by, the occurrences became more frequent, more deliberate. He started to wonder if someone was on to him, if Karen and her crew had caught wind of what was really happening behind the locked doors of that shed. Mark tried not to overthink it, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the goons were more than just curious about a few stray weeds in his garden or an unsanctioned paint job on his fence. Their interest in his property had become obsessive, almost personal. And now, as he watched them inch closer to the shed, that nagging feeling deep in his gut told him they weren't just here for a simple inspection. They were after something, whether they realized it or not. He couldn't see them clearly from the window, but the way they moved, slow and deliberate, as though trying not to draw attention to themselves, sent a chill down his spine. Karen had always been a stickler for rules, but she had no idea what she was about to uncover. If she thought she was just going to open the shed and inspect a few things, she was wrong. She had no clue that behind that weathered door lay something much darker, much more dangerous than she could possibly comprehend. The goons, oblivious to the gravity of the situation, were now standing right in front of the shed, eyes trained on the lock. One of them, a tall, wiry man, fiddled with a set of tools trying to pry open the door. Mark felt a knot form in his stomach. He could almost hear the metallic scrape of the tools as they worked, and his mind raced with the worst-case scenarios. What if they found something they shouldn't? What if the ATF had made a mistake and left something behind? Something that could link Mark to operations he'd never intended to be involved in. He reached for his phone, his hands shaking as he considered his options. He could call Paul, but it was too risky. If the wrong people found out about his involvement, it would be over. If the ATF had any idea that Mark's shed was about to be compromised, it would trigger a chain of events he couldn't control. The danger was real now, and it was only a matter of time before the goons broke through. He needed to act fast, before Karen and her crew discovered just how far their trespassing was about to go. Mark's pulse quickened, his eyes never leaving the shed. Every second felt like an eternity. The goons were moments away from opening the door, and he had no idea what would happen once they did. Would they be satisfied with whatever they found? Or would they trigger something that none of them would be prepared for? One thing was certain. The quiet life Mark had worked so hard to build was about to be shattered by a trespasser who had no idea what she was about to awaken. The moment the lock on the shed clicked open, Mark's heart skipped a beat. He'd been watching from the window, every nerve on edge, as Karen and her goons worked their way around the door, trying to force it open. He knew it was only a matter of time before they succeeded. But now that they had, the reality of what was happening hit him all at once. His palms were sweating as he gripped the edge of the windowsill, barely able to tear his eyes away from the scene unfolding in his yard. Karen stood a few feet back, arms crossed, watching as one of her goons, the wiry man from before, worked tirelessly with a crowbar to pry the door open. The shed, which had once been nothing more than a simple storage space, was now a ticking time bomb in their hands. Mark had no idea how much time he had left before they opened that door completely. But he knew it wasn't going to be good. Not for him. Not for anyone. Mark's mind raced. What should he do? He thought about running out there, confronting them before they went any further, but the consequences of such an action could be catastrophic. He'd never be able to explain the situation in a way that made sense. He couldn't just tell Karen and her goons that they were trespassing on federal property, that what they were about to uncover was far beyond anything they could imagine. The risk was too great, and as much as he hated it, he had no choice but to watch. He was powerless in that moment, a silent observer to his own unraveling. The door finally creaked open, and a gust of musty, stale air escaped, carrying with it the faint scent of oil and metal. The goons stepped back, exchanging glances as they waited for their leader to give the order. Karen's eyes gleamed with satisfaction as she took a step forward, clearly expecting to find nothing more than a few old garden tools or broken furniture. She had no idea what lay inside. "Go ahead," Karen said, her voice low and commanding. "Take a look." The wiry man stepped forward, his hand reaching for the door as he pushed it open all the way. The shed was dark inside, but the faint glow of the afternoon sunlight filtered through the cracks in the wooden walls, casting long shadows on the floor. Mark couldn't see what they saw, but the way their eyes widened as they stepped inside told him everything he needed to know. For a long moment, there was silence. Then the tall, broad-shouldered man with the clipboard, who had remained quiet up until this point, spoke, his voice tight with disbelief. This doesn't look like just a garden shed." Karen stepped inside, her heels clicking on the concrete floor, and Mark could hear the soft rustling of her steps as she moved deeper into the shed. She paused, and then her voice rose, sharp with accusation. "What is this? Are you running some kind of Illegal operation here? Mark's chest tightened as he watched from the window, the sweat on his brow now beading like tiny droplets of anxiety. He could hear the commotion inside as the goons rummaged through the crates and tarps, their movements growing more frantic. Every second they spent inside felt like an eternity. Mark's mind raced. How could he stop them without exposing himself? Without risking it all? The goons hadn't seen everything yet, but they were getting closer. Mark could hear them whispering to each other now, murmuring about what they had found. The crates, the boxes stacked in neat rows, the tools that didn't belong in a typical backyard shed. Suddenly there was a loud clang, something metal falling to the ground. Mark flinched at the sound, his breath catching in his throat. Had one of them found something they shouldn't? Was it too late? "Karen, you need to come see this," one of the goons called out. The tone in his voice had shifted from curiosity to genuine concern. We don't know what this stuff is." Karen's voice came back, her words cold and edged with impatience. "I don't care what it is. We're going to take it all in. We'll call the police and report it." Mark's stomach dropped. It was one thing for Karen to make empty threats, but now she was taking this too far. If she called the police, the ATF's entire operation would be exposed. If the authorities were notified, it would trigger an investigation, and Mark would be swept up in it. He couldn't let that happen. Not now. Not when it was just a matter of time before the full extent of what was hidden in the shed became clear. Mark's heart pounded in his chest as he weighed his options. He knew he had only moments to act, but the timing was critical. If he made his move too soon, he might trigger a chain of events that would escalate things beyond his control. But if he waited too long, Karen and her goons might stumble upon something they couldn't ignore. The truth was, he couldn't stop them from snooping, but he could try to keep them in the dark. He had to find a way to shut it down before things spiraled any further. The seconds ticked by slowly as Mark watched through the window. Karen and her goons were still inside, still inspecting, still unaware of the full danger they were stepping into. He could feel the tension mounting, the weight of the situation pressing down on him with each passing moment. This was no longer just about a simple trespassing incident. This was about protecting everything he'd worked so hard to keep hidden, and ensuring that the people in his backyard didn't turn his quiet life into a living nightmare. The moment the goons started pulling open the crates, Mark knew things had taken a dangerous turn. His eyes never left the shed as the men fumbled through stacks of supplies, each more inconspicuous than the last. But as one of them pried open a sealed box, Mark's stomach dropped. The unmistakable shape of a firearm emerged from the shadows, a sleek black rifle gleaming under the dim light filtering through the cracks of the shed. Then another, and another. The man stepped back, wide-eyed, his fingers still trembling around the weapon like it was some kind of alien object. "What the hell is this?" The wiry man's voice trembled with disbelief as he pulled the rifle out, inspecting it with a nervous gaze. He held it like it might explode in his hands. "This isn't just some old junk. This is military-grade equipment." Mark's breath hitched. He had seen those weapons before. Some were state-of-the-art, others, far more lethal, were rare enough to make even hardened law enforcement wary. These weren't just guns. They were part of a bigger operation. The ATF had been using his shed as a covert storage facility for sensitive materials, and now, with one careless mistake, Karen and her crew had unearthed it all. If they weren't careful, this could go south fast. A cold sweat broke out on Mark's forehead. The goons had no idea what they had just stumbled into. They were standing in the middle of an operation that was above their pay grade, one that involved national security, covert surveillance, and more. And with each second that passed, they were closer to exposing it all. The weapons, the tactical gear, everything could be traced back to him. And with it, the shadowy involvement of the ATF, an organization he'd hoped never to get caught in the middle of. Karen stood a few feet back, looking at the scene unfolding with a mix of confusion and growing frustration. "What is all this? This isn't right!" she shouted, her voice echoing in the small space. She seemed oblivious to the danger at hand. To her, this was just another opportunity to enforce her rules, to make her mark on the neighborhood. But she had no idea that what she was holding could unravel everything. Mark's mind raced as he watched the goons fumble with the weapons. His instincts kicked in, but the weight of his choices felt suffocating. If he ran out there, confronted them, it would escalate everything. If he called the authorities, there was no telling how far this situation would spiral. The ATF had trusted him, and the last thing he wanted was to be dragged into an investigation that could end in criminal charges. But just letting them take everything and expose it was not an option either. They had no idea what they were tampering with. A sharp, panicked voice broke through his thoughts. "We need to get out of here," one of the goons shouted. "This isn't safe." Karen looked at him, her eyes narrowing in irritation. "Get a grip. We're not going anywhere until we figure out what's going on. This is a violation of HOA regulations, and we're going to—" But her words were cut off as the goon holding the rifle dropped it, the heavy metal clanging against the floor like a bombshell. Mark's chest tightened. It was as if the air had been sucked out of the yard. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, suffocating him with its consequences. The goons were starting to panic, but they had no idea what kind of mess they were in. Mark was losing control. The situation was spiraling out of hand, and the only way out now was to make a decision that would shape everything. He could step in, confront them head-on, and try to salvage what little was left of his carefully crafted world. Or he could call Paul, his old college buddy, and get the ATF involved before this snowballed into something much worse. But doing either of those things felt like inviting chaos. One wrong move, and everything. His home, his life, his freedom could be gone in an instant. His gaze flickered to the weapons still scattered across the floor. His heart pounded as the thought flashed in his mind. What if the goons didn't know enough to be scared? What if they picked up the wrong weapon, the wrong tool, and used it without realizing the kind of damage it could cause? Mark's perception of the situation shifted. This wasn't just about trespassing or disobeying HOA rules anymore. This was about life and death. About everything he'd ever worked for being torn apart in front of his eyes. The shed, which had once been a quiet space for storage, had now become a ticking time bomb. It wasn't just about keeping Karen out. It was about protecting the secrets buried deep within those walls. And Mark had to figure out what kind of person he was going to be in that moment. Was he going to stand by, letting the storm unfold, or would he do whatever it took to shield the bigger picture from crashing down? His heart raced as the goons shifted uncomfortably, clearly uneasy about what they had found. The next few moments would decide everything. He could no longer pretend this was just a small neighborhood nuisance. It had become a war zone, and Mark, for better or worse, was right in the middle of it. Mark's mind spun as the reality of the situation set in. Karen and her goons were completely unaware of what they had just uncovered. The shed wasn't just some neighborhood storage space, it was a crucial part of an ongoing covert operation. But as the goons stood frozen, still in disbelief over the weapons they'd found, Mark was transported back to the moment when his connection with the ATF had first begun. It had been years ago when Mark, fresh out of law school and struggling to make a name for himself, had been approached by a close friend from college. Paul Reynolds, now a senior agent with the ATF, had needed help with a legal issue that was too delicate for the Bureau's in-house lawyers. Mark had agreed, not knowing that the favor would pull him deep into a world he'd never imagined. The request was simple: help secure some legal paperwork for a confidential investigation. But what started as a favor had led to a larger role in a highly classified operation. Mark had become the ATF's unofficial legal advisor, someone they could trust to handle sensitive cases involving firearms, explosives, and national security. They needed a civilian, someone who wouldn't raise suspicion, to house evidence, and materials in places that could never be traced back to the agency. And Mark, needing the extra income and intrigued by the complexity of the work, had agreed. That's how his shed, the very one Karen and her goons had just broken into, had become a temporary storage facility for weapons and tactical gear, a place where items used in investigations, materials too dangerous or sensitive to be stored in government facilities, were kept hidden until the proper channels could be used to move them. He'd signed non-disclosure agreements, sworn to secrecy, and signed off on a whole set of terms that he never truly understood. All he knew was that his part in the operation was supposed to be quiet, unassuming. He was just a lawyer, after all, helping with legal paperwork and keeping everything on the down low. But now, as he watched the goons mess around with what could be a national security threat, he realized the magnitude of the situation. Each weapon in that shed had a purpose. Some had been involved in an ongoing investigation into an international arms trafficking ring. Others were tied to covert surveillance operations used to track suspects who might never even know they were being watched. Mark wasn't sure of all the details. He wasn't meant to know them. But he knew enough to understand how catastrophic it would be if these items fell into the wrong hands, or worse, if the wrong people were connected to them. He'd seen firsthand what happened when investigations like these went public. Careers were destroyed, lives were ruined, and entire operations were compromised. This wasn't a game. This was life and death. Mark's chest tightened as he realized just how deep the hole was. The goons had no idea what they were dealing with. They had no idea that the ATF's operation could be jeopardized by a simple trespass. If Karen went public, if she decided to call the police or expose this as some random HOA violation, the entire operation could unravel. All those years of work, those investigations that were still ongoing, could be wiped out in an instant. Agents could be put at risk, sources could be exposed, and the weapons would no longer be under the control of the ATF. The worst part? Mark's involvement would never stay hidden. They would trace everything back to him. And just like that, he would go from an unsuspecting lawyer helping with paperwork to a key player in a federal crime. No one would believe that he'd been caught in the crossfire. His life would be shattered, and the fallout would be irreversible. Mark's pulse quickened, and his thoughts turned to the worst-case scenario. If Karen decided to push this any further, if she called the authorities and demanded that the shed be investigated, there would be no stopping it. The ATF had worked too hard to keep these operations under wraps. They were relying on people like Mark to keep quiet, to protect the materials from exposure. But now, a few innocent mistakes were threatening to bring the entire thing down. His stomach twisted with anxiety as he watched Karen and her goons dig deeper into the crates. The goons had no idea what they were holding. They were so far out of their depth that Mark's fear turned to something darker. Dread. The ticking clock in his head grew louder, and with every passing second Mark could feel the walls closing in. He didn't just need to stop the goons. He needed to stop them before the ATF was dragged into the mess. He couldn't afford to make a mistake. Not now. The stakes had just gone through the roof, and there was no way out but to act. But how? How could he confront Karen without exposing everything? How could he fix this before the damage was irreversible? Mark glanced at the goons once more, their hands shaking as they pawed through the contents of the shed, oblivious to the nightmare they were about to unleash. They weren't just trespassing. They were in the process of uncovering a federal investigation, one that would be torn apart the moment they spoke to the wrong person. Mark knew the clock was ticking. The situation had just shifted from bad to catastrophic, and if he didn't do something soon, everything he'd worked for could be gone in a matter of minutes. Mark's steps were deliberate as he approached the shed, every inch of him screaming, to get there before things escalated further. His mind raced, but his exterior remained calm. Too calm, almost. He couldn't let panic take over. If he showed fear, they would see it. And if Karen saw it, this whole situation could spiral out of control faster than he could even think about. As he rounded the corner of the shed, the sight before him was worse than he imagined. Karen stood near the entrance, hands on her hips, glaring at the goons who were still nervously shifting the weapons around. Their faces were pale, and they looked like they were caught between fear and disbelief. The rifles were lying in the open, with crates of ammunition scattered carelessly across the floor. And the goons? They were just standing there, clueless, still too overwhelmed to realize the gravity of the situation. "Karen?" Mark's voice cut through the tension like a blade, smooth and controlled. "This needs to stop. Right now." His words hung in the air, thick with warning. Karen turned sharply, her eyes narrowing in defiance. "Oh, it's you. I should have known. You've been hiding all this from us, haven't you?" She pointed, a finger at the goons. "These are my HOA goons. They've been trying to enforce the rules. And you, look at this. This is against the law." Mark took a breath, trying not to let the adrenaline cloud his judgment. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing on him. This wasn't just about a petty violation or HOA rules anymore. This was about something much bigger, and if he didn't handle it with care, everything would be lost. The weapons, the operation, his life. "Karen, you have no idea what's going on here," Mark said calmly, stepping closer. "This isn't a matter of HOA regulations or petty neighborhood squabbles. What you found in here? This is a federal investigation. These weapons belong to the ATF, not me. They're here for a reason, and you've just stumbled onto something you're not equipped to handle." For a brief moment, Karen looked taken aback. She glanced at the goons, and then back at Mark, her expression hardening again. "I don't care what they are," she snapped. "You're breaking the law. No one should have this kind of firepower in a suburban neighborhood. I'm not letting this slide. You're going to take all of this out of here, or I will call the cops right now." Mark's pulse quickened. The last thing he needed was for Karen to bring the police into this. He knew that if the authorities got involved, it wouldn't just be about some minor infraction. He could kiss his life goodbye. The ATF would be forced to acknowledge his involvement, and once they did, they'd have to investigate everything. And that meant opening up a Pandora's box he could never close. "No, Karen," Mark said, his voice low but firm. "You don't understand. If you call the cops, you'll be putting everyone here, including yourself, in danger." He paused, weighing his next words carefully. "These weapons aren't just for show. They're part of a major investigation, one that's been ongoing for months. You don't know what you're dealing with, and if you push this any further, you could jeopardize everything." Karen stared at him, a skeptical laugh escaping her lips. "You think I'm going to just let this slide because you say it's some federal investigation? These things are illegal. You can't just hide them away like they're nothing." "You're not going to intimidate me, Mark. I'm calling the police, and you're going to be arrested for having this stuff in your shed." Mark felt his stomach tighten. This wasn't just a matter of talking his way out of it anymore. He needed to get through to her. Fast. The goons were still standing there looking bewildered, and they were just one wrong move away from calling in the wrong people. "Karen," Mark began again, his voice sharp with urgency, "this is no longer about you or me. This is about something much bigger, and you're about to make a huge mistake." But Karen was relentless. "I don't care about your excuses, Mark. I'm demanding you remove all of this from my neighborhood. Now." He could feel the walls closing in on him. The tension in the air was thick, and Karen's defiance was starting to get under his skin. Mark's mind raced. There was no reasoning with her. She was too blinded by her need for control. But the goons, they were still in the dark. They had no idea what they'd just uncovered. They were caught up in Karen's misguided mission and had no understanding of the danger they were in. He forced a calm smile, hiding the rising panic inside. "All right, Karen, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. "I'll call Paul," he said, his voice laced with just enough sincerity to sound convincing. "He's an agent with the ATF, and he can explain everything. But I need you to trust me. For your own sake, don't call the police. Let me handle this." Karen glared at him for a moment, her arms crossed tightly. She didn't buy it. "And if I don't?" Mark took a deep breath, his mind working quickly. "If you don't, then you'll have made a grave mistake. You don't want to push this any further. Trust me." The seconds stretched like hours. The goons exchanged uneasy glances, clearly torn between following Karen's orders and hearing out Mark. But no one moved. The situation teetered on the edge of chaos, and Mark knew one wrong word could send it all crashing down. Mark's fingers trembled slightly as he dialed the number. He had dealt with high-stakes situations before, but nothing like this. Not with Karen and her HOA goons on his property, trespassing and snooping around things they had no business touching. But this was bigger than just a rogue neighborhood enforcer. This was federal. The ATF was his only hope now. He leaned against the shed, phone pressed to his ear, heart pounding in his chest. The call rang twice before the voice on the other end picked up. "Agent Paul, this better be important." "Paul, it's Mark." "We've got a problem," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Karen's HOA team broke into the shed. They found the weapons, and now they're demanding I remove everything, or they'll call the police." "This is bigger than they think." There was a pause, followed by a sigh that Mark could hear over the line. "I'll be there in 10. Don't let anyone leave." Mark hung up, exhaling deeply, his mind swirling with what he'd just unleashed. His world, which had felt solid just hours ago, now felt like it was teetering on the edge of a cliff. The ATF agents were coming, but would they be enough to fix this? Could they cover up the mess Karen and her goons had created? As the sound of a distant siren broke the silence, Mark stepped away from the shed and walked slowly toward the house. The goons hadn't moved an inch. They were still there, frozen in place, eyes wide, trying to process what they'd just stumbled upon. They'd gone from neighborhood enforcers to unwitting participants in something much darker. Karen, meanwhile, stood at the front of the shed, arms crossed tightly over her chest, glaring at Mark. "This isn't over. You can't hide behind the ATF forever, Mark. This is illegal, and I will make sure everyone knows about it." Her voice was steady, but there was something in her eyes that made Mark pause. Something cold, calculating. She wasn't just upset anymore. She was desperate. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, the screech of tires cut through the air. Two black SUVs pulled into the driveway, their engines rumbling loudly as they came to a halt. Mark's pulse quickened. The doors of the vehicles slammed open, and a team of ATF agents spilled out, all wearing tactical gear. Their presence was commanding. Their eyes were trained, sharp, as they moved with precision. Mark didn't have to say a word. He simply gestured toward the shed. "Good to see you, Mark," Paul said, walking toward him, his expression serious. Paul was a no-nonsense agent, one of the best. "What the hell's going on here?" Mark nodded toward Karen, his voice low. "They broke in, Paul. They've seen everything, and they have no idea what they've stumbled into." Paul raised an eyebrow, looking between Mark and Karen. His sharp gaze flicked to the goons standing around awkwardly. "This is your neighborhood HOA, huh? You're in way over your heads," he muttered under his breath, more to himself than anyone else. Karen's defiance, however, didn't waver. She squared her shoulders, stepping forward. "You can't do this," she snapped at Paul. "You're the ones breaking the law. This is my property and you're on it without permission. I'll have every one of you arrested." Paul didn't flinch. Instead, he gave a slight smirk, his demeanor icy and unshaken. "You've got no idea what you're dealing with, ma'am, and it's about to get a lot more complicated for you." The goons were pale now, their faces slack with disbelief as they watched the agents move with practiced professionalism. They had no idea what was happening, and that was clear from the way they shifted uneasily on their feet, each one probably wondering if they were about to be arrested for the mess they had inadvertently made. "Get them out of here," Paul ordered one of his agents. The agent moved quickly, signaling the goons to step away from the shed. "Karen," Paul continued, his tone hardening, "I suggest you stay quiet. This doesn't concern you anymore. The federal investigation into this weapons cache is officially underway, and if I were you, I'd start thinking about how much trouble you're about to be in." Mark's heart raced, but not for the reasons he had expected. Karen had been so intent on her mission to police the neighborhood that she hadn't realized the walls were closing in on her. There was something off about her reaction, something that hadn't sat right with him since the moment she first began her little HOA crusade. He wasn't sure if it was the coldness in her eyes or the way she'd kept pushing this entire issue. Despite the warnings, but something about her wasn't adding up. "Paul?" Mark spoke softly, his voice lowering to just above a whisper. "There's something you need to know about Karen. She's involved. She's not just some angry homeowner. There's more here. I don't know what, but I have a feeling she's connected to some of the criminal activity that brought all this down." Paul gave him a sharp look, his brow furrowing in suspicion. "How do you know that?" Mark hesitated for a moment before answering. "Just watch her. The way she's acting. It's more than just a vendetta against me. There's something deeper here, and I think we need to look into it before it's too late." Paul nodded, his expression unreadable. "We'll handle it. For now, we've got a bigger problem to deal with. But I'll make sure we look into Karen." The realization that Karen might be more than just a misguided HOA enforcer sent a chill through Mark. His gut told him this wasn't just some coincidence. This had all been part of something much bigger than anyone had first thought. The situation had gone from bad to worse in record time, and now, with the ATF involved, there was no turning back. The truth was coming to light, and nothing, least of all Karen, was going to stop it now. The tension in the air was thick as the ATF agents finished securing the scene. Mark stood a little to the side, watching as the goons were herded into one of the SUVs, their faces pale with a mixture of fear and confusion. Karen, on the other hand, stood frozen, her posture rigid, her hands clenched at her sides, as though she could will her way out of the mess she'd created. Paul, the lead agent, approached Mark once the dust had settled, his eyes scanning the shed, the vehicles, and the now scattered HOA members. The calmness of his demeanor contrasted sharply with the chaos of the past few hours. "We've got a full team handling the site now," he said, nodding to the agents who were cataloging the weapons and other sensitive items in the shed. "But this is only the beginning." Mark gave a slow nod, his eyes never leaving Karen. "She's not just some nosy neighbor, is she?" Paul's lips thinned. "No. She's in deeper than she's letting on. This whole thing, this was no accident. We've been tracking a group for months now, a network that's been laundering weapons through civilian properties. The HOA? It's a front." Mark's stomach dropped. The woman who had made his life miserable with her trivial rules and petty demands was involved in something much more dangerous. And what was worse, she hadn't just stumbled onto it. She had been a willing participant. Just then, Karen broke her silence, her voice dripping with venom. "You think you've won, don't you? You don't know what you've gotten yourself into. You don't know who's backing me." Mark could hear the edge in her voice. Her anger was fueled by something deeper, fear maybe, or the weight of her own crumbling empire. She had been confident just moments ago, but now, as the truth came to light, she was desperate, clinging to any shred of control she could hold on to. "You're going to wish you'd just let it go," Karen added, her eyes darting nervously from Mark to the agents. But Mark was done being intimidated. He had kept his cool throughout the ordeal, and now, as everything fell into place, he finally felt like he had the upper hand. "You're not in control anymore, Karen. You're done. And "So is your little operation." Paul's eyes met Mark's, a brief acknowledgement of the shift in power. "We'll make sure she's held accountable. The full investigation will reveal everything. This isn't over for her." But the final twist came when one of the agents, a younger man with dark hair and sharp eyes, approached Paul with a sealed envelope. He handed it over without a word. Paul opened it, his eyes scanning the contents with a growing frown. "This is bad," Paul muttered under his breath, before turning to Mark. "We've just connected Karen to an even larger criminal network. The weapons were just one part of it. The real operation was much more extensive. We've got financial ties, organized crime, and more. She's been playing both sides, pretending to be some neighborhood enforcer while secretly laundering money and weapons for some pretty dangerous people." Mark felt a rush of satisfaction and relief. Karen had tried to play him, to make him her target, but in the end, it was her own arrogance that had led to her downfall. The goons had been quiet now, each one clearly processing the implications of what was unfolding. Their role had been foolish, but they were merely pawns in a much larger game. Still, Mark couldn't help but feel a little bit of satisfaction as they were carted away by the agents. They were about to face consequences for their actions. As the ATF agents wrapped up their investigation, Mark stood by the shed, his thoughts swirling. The sound of the agents' movements, their conversation as they packed up the final pieces of evidence, all felt strangely surreal. He had never expected his quiet suburban life to spiral into something so chaotic, something so dangerous. Karen's reputation was now forever tied to this mess. Her involvement in criminal activities would be exposed. She wouldn't just be remembered as the HOA Karen who had made his life difficult. She would be remembered as the mastermind behind an underground operation that had now been dismantled by the ATF. In the days that followed, Mark kept a low profile. The neighborhood slowly returned to normal, though he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd narrowly escaped something much worse. He had been on the receiving end of the HOA's harassment for so long that he hadn't even considered what lay beneath it. But now, as he reflected on everything, he realized just how lucky he was to have avoided becoming part of something far darker. Karen was arrested, and her role in the criminal syndicate became a headline. Her plans, her attempts at controlling him in the neighborhood, all crumbled when the truth came to light. The once strong figure of Karen, the unrelenting HOA enforcer, was reduced to a figure of ridicule in the community. And despite everything, Mark couldn't help but feel a grim satisfaction. The woman who had caused him so much stress was now facing the consequences of her own actions. As he sat on his porch that evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Mark couldn't help but reflect on the strange, twisted path that had brought him here. It had started with a simple issue, a woman who thought she could dictate how others lived, but it had turned into a dangerous game of cat and mouse that neither of them had expected. But in the end, the game was over, and Mark had won. If you enjoyed this video and want to see the next part, let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay updated. See you in the next one. Your support means the world.